I got a question from a subscriber asking if I could do something on dependency injection. Now, I've mentioned dependency injection in various other videos when we've been dealing with ASP.NET Core, because you can't really do that without dependency injection. But it's always been just a peripheral thing to make it work, not something I've focused on. So I thought I'd do a few videos looking at the whole idea of dependency injection. We'll start out in ASP.NET Core, but we'll also look at it in other environments as well to see how it can be used in different circumstances. Now, the basic idea behind dependency injection is very closely related to one of the 5 solid code principles, which is dependency inversion, which we covered in an earlier video. But the basic idea is if you've got 2 components, A and B, you don't want A to be dependent on B, but equally you don't want B to be dependent on A. And so you introduce an interface and make both A and B dependent only on the interface. And then as long as the interface remains stable, then you can make whatever changes you like to A and B, and the one won't affect the other. And having that stable interface is also related to another of the solid code principles, the interface segregation principle, which we also talked about. So that's dependency inversion. Dependency injection is really the practical implementation of how we're going to make that work. And it's something that's been around for a long, long time. There's been lots of libraries that give you support for it. You could do it for yourself, but there are libraries to support it. But it was only really with .NET Core that Microsoft introduced their own library to do this. And so out of the box, you've just got it available. You might still want to use one of those third-party ones. They have more features possibly than the built-in .NET Core ones. But in my circumstances, I've never really found a requirement more than what we get directly with .NET Core. So let's take a look at the application I've put together here. And what I've got to start with is just a simple SQLite database where I've got a table containing ratings for books. So we can see I've just put a small amount of data in there, but we've got repeated books. So someone's given Dr. Noah 5, someone else has given Dr. Noah 2, someone else has given Dr. Noah 1, and similarly for other books as well. And if I just run up the application, we've got a website, and what it does is just lists that information. So there we've simply got the data from the database. That's on the home page. I've also got this summary page, and this doesn't work at the moment. At the moment, it just shows exactly the same thing. But what it's intended to do is aggregate that data. So it's intended to produce a single row for Dr. No that has the average of those ratings for Dr. No, a single row for Emma, single row for Persuasion, single row for Goldfinger. And so just to summarize that information. And this gives us quite a nice look at the various ways that we can use dependency injection. Now, as the program stands, all I've done here is I've got my book review entity, so just an ID and then title and rating, and then I've created a DB context that just has that list of book reviews, and then in startup I have configured that as a DB context using SQLite in there. And that's the sort of thing I've done in plenty of videos before when we've been looking at Entity Framework Core and how that works. But already we've actually got some idea of what we have with dependency injection, because this adding of the DB context also configures it for dependency injection. Because if we now look at the controller, so here's our home controller, then you can see that the constructor takes a parameter of that DB context and then uses it just to get hold of the book reviews. And that really gives us a good indication of the key problem that in these sorts of circumstances dependency injection is trying to solve. Because the thing about a controller is that we as a programmer never get to actually call that constructor. We can do all sorts of configuration basically that says that that constructor should be called. So we've got down here where we just basically say we've got a controller, we've got an action, that sort of thing. That's configuring the system to know when a request is made from the client which controller to create, but the actual creation is done automatically, and therefore we don't get access to the point at which new home controller is called, and therefore we don't get to put in that DB context. And that's really one of the practical benefits we get from dependency injection, that we simply configure the behavior like we did in startup, and the system will add that in there directly. Now, in .NET Framework, in ASP.NET, we didn't have dependency injection, and if you had a situation then where you had a controller that needed to have data passed into its constructor, what you'd actually then have to do is write your own controller factory. And so you'd have a factory that was called by the system that would create your controller, but because you'd written the code, you could say, and the constructor takes a particular parameter. But given that was really the main reason for it, just to provide constructor parameters, it seems easier to have this generalized injection mechanism than to have this more specific factory mechanism. So that's why we've got this injection in ASP.NET Core. And so we can see what happens. We've done the configuration in startup by adding that context, and then whenever we create a controller, if we want to use the context, we just pass it in as a parameter and it will get passed in. So if I put a break in there and run it up, we can see that when it hits that breakpoint, we can't see where that's been called from. We've just got external code. It's somewhere inside the system, but it's provided us with a valid DB context, and from that we can do things like get the book reviews in this case and display the results. So that's our first encounter really when we use it with a DB context. But something that I've spoken about before when we were looking at Entity Framework is the idea that you sometimes don't want to directly access the DB context. You want to use a design pattern known as repository. And so I've actually put one in here. I've put this in a folder called services because service is a general term for something which can be injected. So that's just the general idea. Even though the purpose of things that can be injected can be very diverse, if it can be injected, we call it a service. And so what I've put in here is an interface called iBook Review Repository. And typical idea of a repository, it just means that rather than client code in the controller having to make specific queries on the DB context, we kind of pre-wrap those. So we've got a property that will just give us back all the book reviews, and then we've got another one that will give us back the book reviews for a particular title. And then the implementation of that interface is pretty straightforward. It itself picks up a DB context, and then for all, it just calls book reviews, and then for by title, it does a where just to filter by the title. And so what we can now do is in our home controller, forget about having the DB context. We're now just going to have this iBook Review repository that we'll call underscore repository. And we'll take that to be injected, and then we'll just say underscore repository equals repository. And then of course we've now got to in here say underscore repository.all and put it in there as well. And so now we've hidden away the DB context inside the repository, and all the controller knows about is this book review repository itself. If we run that up, however, we'll get this great big error basically saying it doesn't know what it's supposed to inject when we ask for an iBook Review repository. So we're asking for one here, but we haven't done the necessary configuration so the system knows what it needs to provide. And that, as you might expect, is done in startup. So it was in startup here where we configured the DB context itself. And all we need to do is say services, and then we say .add, and I'm going to do add transient. Now there's some options here, and we'll talk about those in a later video, but to start with, add transient is the simplest one. And then we use generic parameters to basically say if somebody asks for an iBook Review repository, so if somebody asks for the interface, give them our implementation. So just the book review repository. And this is one of the nice things about injection. It means if we had multiple different classes implementing that same interface, it would just be a configuration change in here to say which one was going to be used. So we could have a completely different type of repository that maybe got the data from a web service rather than directly from a database. It would just be a configuration change as long as it conformed to that interface. But once we've done that, then we can see that that is behaving in the same way. So now, if we put our breakpoint on here, we can see we're getting the repository passed in. But also something to notice, remember the repository constructor itself needed the DB context. Well, remember that was already configured for injection. We had that from the start. And so if we look inside that repository, we can see it has a DB context. So what's happened there is when the dependency injection discovered that it needed a book review repository, it attempted to create one. It then discovered that a book review repository needs a DB context, and so it passed that one in there. So that's really nice. Once you've got these things configured, then they just get injected wherever they may be needed. And so that's given us the whole thing working all the way through. And in fact, we can look at that in a slightly more customized way with two of our own services rather than using the DB context. Because remember, we want this idea of having a summary. And there's various ways we could do this. We could actually just put some code directly in the home controller here that would calculate that summary information. And in a simple case, that arguably might be a good thing to do, but it's always better if you've got a separate job to put it into a separate class. And so let's do that. Let's have another service, and let's do this in the same way. We're going to have an interface that we'll call iReviewAggregator and make that public. And all that needs is a simple property which is going to return an IEnumerable of book reviews, and we'll just call that summary, and it's going to just have a get. And then we'll also add the implementation of that. So this one's just going to be called Review Aggregator. And it's going to implement the iReview aggregator interface, implement the interface, and then what we're going to do here is, obviously to do a summary, we need to get hold of the data which we know is stored in the repository. So this is where we're going to have injection into an injectable item. So once again, here I'm going to say private read-only book review repository. So it's a similar setup every time. Pop in a constructor, take that as the parameter, and then once again underscore repository equals repository. And what that means is that here I can now get the data and do the summary. So what I'm going to say here is underscore repository, and then we know it's got the all or the by title. Well, we'll just use the all here, and then we've got to do our processing. And so what I can do, some quite neat link coding here, I'm going to do a group by, so sort it into groups, and those groups are going to be based on the title. So we can say r gives r dot title, so that will break it down into groups. So we had, in our actual data, we had 4 separate titles, though we had several reviews for each one, so it'll have broken it into 4 groups. And then what we can do is get out of that this summary. So I'm going to say select another lambda, so G for group gives, and then what I'm going to create here is a new book review, so we can use that for the summary information as well as for the individual items. I'm going to say title equals group dot key. So when you've done this group by, whatever you grouped it on title becomes the key. And then I'm going to say rating equals, and then we can simply say G again, which is the group, which is the collection now of all the items that have that particular title. So all the ratings for Dr. No, all the ratings for Emma, whatever it may be. So I'm just going to again use link and do the average of, and then we want to pick out of that the rating, so pick out rating on there. So that will give us simply 4 book reviews one per title with a rating which is the average of all of the ratings for that particular title. One other thing I'll do is, just for tidiness, let's do a math.round on that, so that we'll just round it to 2 decimal places, just so it looks nice when we display it. So that's the functionality, but the key point is we've put it into another service, another thing that can be injected. And so to use that, we can go through the same process. So here we're now going to have an iReview aggregator that we'll call aggregator, and then we'll pass that in as a second parameter. You can see if you use a lot of this, you end up having a large number of parameters in your constructors, which can be a bit messy. In the next video, we'll look at a neat way to get around that if it's proving to be a problem, but we'll keep it as the simple version for now. So there we've got our aggregator, and that just means now in the summary, rather than having underscore repository.all, which was giving us the wrong result, we now just do underscore aggregator dot summary. And the nice thing is, remember, both all and summary just give us back an IEnumerable of book reviews, so we can use the same view. We've got this index view, which just does a table displaying the information. So we don't have to have a new view to get that working. But remember, the final thing we've got to do is go back to startup, because we've also got to register that second service. So here we're going to have our iReview aggregator and the implementation of it. And so now when we run that one up, we can see on the main page we're still getting that, but if we go to the summary, you can see it's grouped it into those 4 different books that we happen to have, and then provided the average rating for each one, which was exactly what we wanted. But again, the important thing to notice is the way that's worked is that we have had injection into injection, actually into injection. So if I put some breakpoints in there, if I go to the repository, we can see that's getting injected with the context. But if we go to the aggregator, we can see that that is getting injected there. And if we go to the controller and put another break in, we can see the injection that's happening there. So now, if I go back to the page and just refresh it, we hit the creation for the repository, which is injected with the context. We then hit it a second time. Now that's interesting. That's because of the way I configured this. Remember, I configured it as add transient. That means basically we get a different object every time we ask for it, and we'll see how to vary that in the next video. But then if I continue, we can see we're getting the repository injected into the aggregator, and then we're getting both of those injected into the home controller, and it ends up all working. So injection into injection into injection. But although it's quite complicated, it's pretty simple to program and understand, because it all basically comes down to the idea that if we want something, we ask for the interface in our constructor, and then we do the configuration entirely in the startup, in the case of an ASP.NET application, and that sets everything up. And so it just keeps the independence of our various components very clear. The other benefit we get from it, and something that's always worth talking about, the main reason we do this fundamentally is, remember we said we have the ability to vary the implementation of the interface. So we could provide some completely different implementation. And I mentioned kind of real-time applications where you'd have that, where it would be useful if we're getting the data from a web service rather than a database, but it's also very important when it comes to testing, because down here I've created some unit tests. So here we've got our controller tests, which I'll just uncomment, and we've got them there. And the key thing to notice is what we've done here is we have mocked those services, those injectable objects. So I'm using the MockU framework, and I've got the interfaces, and then I can have a mock repository and a mock aggregator. And then when you're doing unit testing, strictly speaking, you're not really doing dependency injection, because remember we said the reason we needed dependency injection was we don't have access to the point in the code where the constructor is being called into which we could pass our services. Well, that's true when you've got the full ASP.NET application, but when you're writing test code, you do have access to the constructor, and so in fact we typically don't use the injection mechanism. We do just hard code it in, so we pass in our mock repository and our mock aggregator. Here we've configured the mock repository to return a couple of books, and that is what will then get fetched out, and so we have an assert to look at those. That's just looking at the main index that looks at all of the books. We've then got our summary, and actually I've divided this up into two separate tests, one of which I've called summary shallow and one of which I've called summary deep. And essentially summary shallow is a genuine unit test in the sense that it only tests the home controller and everything else is mocked. So I've mocked the repository and I've mocked the aggregator, and therefore on the aggregator I've set it up to return what I'm predetermining as the correct summary, the correct averages. And that is then what will get called by the home controller, and we assert that that's valid. So in this case, we know it's a unit test because it's only the home controller that's being tested. We don't actually use the real review repository or the real review aggregator. Whereas here, I've got what we might call an integration test. We're actually, although we're using a mock repository, we are using the real review aggregator. So this test tests both the home controller and the aggregator. And if either one of them got it wrong, then we'd have to work out which one had the error. So on the one hand, it's not as good as a unit test because it doesn't really precisely tell us where the error is. But on the other hand, it tests that we've integrated the things correctly, that the home controller and the review aggregator are working correctly side by side. And so in this case, we actually just have mock data for 4 reviews over 2 books, and you can see that our assert is checking that it's got the averages correct, so that it's got the 3.5 and the 1.5. So that's just another way of doing it, and we get to pick and choose because we can pass into the constructor either a mock object or a real object, and it's up to us what we want to do. But then if we just run the tests, we'll see, as we had before, that we've got green lights coming in there. So that was it for our first look at dependency injection. There are still a number of questions to be answered, which we'll be looking at in future videos. One is related to when we configured these, what is it exactly that we mean by transient and what are the alternatives there. Another one we had was what do we do if we've got this long list of injected services? Can we simplify that? And another one was, well, what if we're not in the realms of ASP.NET at all? Can we still use this idea of dependency injection in other circumstances? The answer to all of those is yes, but you'll have to wait until next time to see it. So if you want to catch that, if you don't want to miss it, do subscribe. If you like this one, do click like, and I'll see you next time.